The diner was packed. Mr. Chrome was waiting in the back booth when I arrived and waved me over as I came in. I had spent the last few weeks researching the prison. The same thing I'd been doing for the previous year. But now, it was with more of an eye towards the strange occurrences. Stragview had its share of unnatural deaths and odd disappearances, but the prison seemed to be good at covering them up. I'd been excited to talk with Crumbs again, and his story made me reach out to some others I had been hesitant to talk to. There was a real story here. I just had to put it together. I had managed to get in touch with him, and he sounded nervous when he spoke to me, unsure about our next meeting, but sure that it had to happen. Chrome had something to say, and he wouldn't be bullied out of saying it. Chrome had set himself near the back wall, the front door in full view. The place was full enough that we would be hard to eavesdrop on, and harder still to pick out of a crowd. The waitress ambled over, and I ordered food. Chrome waited for me when I offered to pay for his meal, just holding out his coffee cup for the waitress to refill. He took a long sip before turning back to me, savoring the dark liquid. So I said I didn't scare you off. Seems like you might have been the one that was spooked. Did you worry you were being tailed? Mr. Chrome looked uncomfortable as he sipped his coffee. His eyes fitted around the diner, and I could tell he was looking for a familiar face. He must have been satisfied with what he saw because he turned back and pitched his voice low. Told you about the warden's influence, right? Well, let's just say that I've seen some things that could get me in a lot of trouble if I went blabbing about them. Then why talk to me at all? I asked, very curious about why he would stick his neck out. Because maybe I need to be in trouble. Maybe it's time that we paid for what we did that night in October. I spent the next 25 years trying to make amends for that night, but it never seemed like enough. No matter where I went or what I did, couldn't shake Fraser's face. We did him a disservice. It's time people knew about it. It's time they knew about a lot of things. Some skeletons are hidden on Stragview. Skeletons need to come out. And some aren't even skeletons yet. Some still want to hear about it all. When I set up the tape recorder between us and clicked it on, he grinned, showing yellow teeth that had seen a lot of coffee and cigarettes in their day. Good. A week later, I saw Fraser with my own eyes. We had a full shift that night, no call-outs or vacations, so every dorm had 2 people in it. I usually worked with the grandfather, but the captain had put me in the dorm with Sergeant Caden. I was told later that he'd gotten a complaint from the officer he'd been put in there the night before. Cap needed someone in there that he was unlikely to sexually harass, and I was elected. I started the paperwork, counted, made small talk, generally tried to write out the night. Caden had apologized for what happened on the yard by then. He claimed that he got a little out of hand, didn't mean to stick me. I had generously accepted it, hinting that the info might be something I'd want to hang on to for later. We'd had a tentative truce since then, and as the thunder rumbled away from the woods, we settled in for a long, boring night. When the rain started, the lights flickered in the cages above the beds, and the tin roof sounded like there might be a little hail in it. We hadn't had a good storm since a week before, and I remembered wondering if it was going to be as crazy as the one your granddad had told me about. When the lightning started, the lights went out completely. That was 9, and we sat with just the emergency lights for company for an hour before the incident took place. Caden was just finishing telling me a story that was 90% bullshit when someone started screaming on the floor. We shined our lights into the dorm, flashing them through a caged box that surrounded us, and we could see someone pinned against the wall. He was looking at whoever's back was to us and shut it all over. The person menacing him was yelling incoherently, and when the lightning peeled overhead, you could see that whoever the other wasn't quite right. His proportions were wrong. He was too big, too undefined. He seemed to move beneath his clothes like a bundle of cords. My dad had a scarecrow made out of old spun-together wires when I was a kid, and this guy looked like he had. His clothes vaguely man-shaped, but not in one solid piece. Caden sprang into action, grabbing his stick, telling me to hang tight. He lumbered onto the floor, shouting at the two to separate. The inmate who was pinned jerked a little as the other reached for him, and I could swear I could see sparks coming off his skin. He reached out a hand to take the man by the throat, and when he did, he started bucking like someone who's grabbed an electric fence. Caden roared as he came at him, bringing that stupid club of his down on the other. I pulled lamely at his shirt, and I could see that whatever lay beneath was more liquid than solid. When the other turned his face and bellowed at Caden, well, that was when I saw him. Inmate Fraser's face was lumpy and damaged, his eyes black pits of red rage, and Caden took a step back as it turned to fix on him with its gaze. The club fell with a hollow wooden thump. Caden began to run as the thing turned away from its target to come after him instead. The inmate that had been pinned, Griggs, his name had been Griggs, crumpled down the wall, still convulsing as he fell. Caden was out the door as the Fraser thing walked jerkily across the floor, and that's when it saw me. His eyes met mine, and I could see nothing but hate, nothing but fear, nothing but uncertainty behind them. He approached me, his eyes locked on me through the glass of the booth, and I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. People were yelling at him to sit down before the other guards got there, but he ignored them. He just kept coming closer and closer to my office. I backed away, trying to put distance between us, but I hit the opposite wall as he came right up to the glass. I could see his deep blue eyes pulsating with deeper energy as he tried to press his face through the wire mesh and glass and fall into the station. I tried to push my backside out the other side and into the adjacent sleeping area, but it remained substantial against me. When he hit the glass with his head, cracking it, causing it to ripple like splintered ice, I yelled loud enough to wake the dead. A team arrived a few minutes later, and when they did, Fraser was gone. He left nothing but a pile of clothes and the splintered glass in his wake. Gone? Where did he go? Chrome shrugged. Vanished, like he had in Foxtrot. If I hadn't seen him for myself, I would have never... When I asked your granddad about it, he seemed unsure about what he'd seen that night after having some time to think about it. Now, I asked if he'd seen Fraser too, but now he didn't seem to want to talk about it. He was scared. But the fear for us had just begun. Caden may have escaped the dorm while Fraser was staring at me. But his luck wouldn't last forever. The waitress brought my food out then. Bacon, eggs, hash browns, and toast, and refilled Crom's coffee again. He let me pick at the food a little bit before he asked if I wanted to continue. I was hooked by this point, enraptured by the story, and the idea of someone having their revenge from their infirmary bed. I nodded, the recorder still running, and he picked back up again. A week later, things had settled down a little. Cade had taken 2 nights off, leaving earlier that night after he'd run straight to Captain's office to tell him about the fight. He had used those 2 days to convince himself that it was all bullshit, that no boogeyman Fraser was out to get him. I mean, he'd seen something, yeah, but it was a trick of light. Besides, Griggs hadn't even died that night. He'd spent a couple of days in the infirmary with light burns on his chest and neck, but he'd made a recovery. As the muggy weather stretched on and the skies stayed cloudless, we all prepared for an unreasonably warm autumn. We hunkered down for some further heat-related inmate issues. And then the storms came back. And it was a bloodbath. It came up suddenly one night. The first peal of thunder seemed to attract the buckets of rain that followed, and the killings weren't far behind. It happened suddenly, without warning. 4 inmates from 4 different dorms as the worst storm of the year raged out of control. The traffic was always the same. 2 inmates fighting, or inmates kicking the doors saying someone was fighting. We had to run from hotel to Echo to Alpha and then back to hotel, though it was a different quad. All 4 seemed to have died of heart attacks, their hearts having just stopped beating all of a sudden. They were deemed heart attacks, but they were seen fighting with other inmates before they died in 2 cases. We would get to the dorm, find a body lying by their bed or crumpled over in the bathroom, with no other combatant in sight. 2 from hotel died in their cells, but both cellmates swore they saw someone in their cell after lockdown, fighting with the victim. That someone couldn't be found, and by the end of the night, we were soaked to the skin and ready to chew nails. The Cap was filling out paperwork, trying not to let this fear show. We left that night, the rain showing no signs of stopping, and luckily, however, the lightning took a break. And we had a week of balmy, rainy weather that made us all wish the heat had been our only concern. I remember my boots being constantly wet for that week. The general feeling of unease as the idea of another string of heart attacks hung over the compound. A week later, the first week of October, the rain retook a thundery tone, and 2 more inmates died of heart attacks. One of them, a guy named Drell, had been walking to an early morning call out when he was suddenly set upon by an unknown person. Macklemore, the officer who'd escorted him, said that they had just rounded the side of Charlie dorm when someone had come out of the shadows and shoved Macklemore over and jumped on Drell. Drell had screamed like a pig who's got his leg hung. But as Macklemore grabbed for his radio, it was already too late. Drell's body was still twitching, but his life has fled. Macklemore said the guy had been enormous, 6 feet at least. But no one was ever found. No one besides Drell was on the yard at the time. A week after that, 2 more were found dead in the beds after the lights came on, both with burn wounds around their throats. And that was when my fellow officers started leaving. Most of them were just smart enough to see the writing on the wall. And they weren't about to get caught up in his bullshit. It was only a matter of time before someone got blamed or an officer got caught up in his nonsense. Caden had already started whispering about what he'd seen. Some of his friends were not real big on getting caught in the crossfire if Frazier came for them. Others were just lazy, simply looking for an excuse to burn vacation time or sick leave. All of them were gutless, and they left the shift ragged, undermanned. A week later, and I was in the captain's office helping with paperwork. So inmates did always take an opportunity when handed to them. They had picked up on this mysterious killer. They decided to run with it. On top of the 10 killings committed by our mysterious man, we had 6 stabbings, 5 assaults, found dozens of new weapons during dorm raids. Our captain was beside himself, worrying that his job was history. He was ragged from running in the rain, which had been falling almost constantly since September had become October. I was sitting with the inmates' files and going over them before sending them to the warden. I started comparing them to the 2 inmates that were killed the first night, 6 of them. Disciplinary notes in their file from the last 6 months. Most of them had cited inmate Frazier as the victim. 4 had been sent to confinement for fighting or stealing. And 2 more had been written up for alleged gang activity. I imagine the others had some sort of run-in with Frazier as well, though they'd been smart enough to keep it under the radar. I felt myself shudder under my wet uniform, remembering what I had seen, and thought of Frazier finding a way to tie up loose ends from his infirmary bed. As I made note in my soggy notebook, I could hear the captain making excuses to the warden on the phone. 10 deaths, multiple injuries, and a lot of man-hours used to quell them. I imagine he was up to his ass in alligators over this. And it wouldn't take much for him to have his bars over it. His fault or not. When the radio crackled and the scared voice of a trainee, Freck, came blaring over it, I thought this might be the straw that broke the camel's back. I need help. Please help me. Officer down. Repeat, officer down in Delta. I need help. Please, someone help me. So we were running before we knew what was going on. So we were running before we even knew what we were doing. Officer down was one of those phrases that elicits immediate action if you're any kind of officer. Doesn't matter if you're the guy who's getting his ass beat or not. You go to help because you'd want him to run if it was you in trouble. So I met your grandfather as we both ran across the grass, slipping and sliding in the mud as we tried to stay upright. We burst through the door to side two together, batons in hand, ready for anything. And that's when I saw a familiar face slumped over a sink. Still twitching. His eyes still jittering and dancing in his skull. As he convulsed, I noticed a pair of discarded blues sitting on the floor by his feet. He was pale, his hand gripping his chest as he looked at us like he thought that we could throw him a raft in these troubled waters. He was one of the officers who'd come to the rec yard with Caden. Officer Miles was receiving his comeuppance for his hand in Fraser's beating, but I wasn't gonna let one of my own get caught up in an inmate's revenge fantasy. Your grandfather and I were on him in a second. He was still breathing, but his heart was fluttering in his chest like a caged bird. We carried him between us, the rain sheeting down as we drug him to medical. Miles was twitching like a landed trout. His feet kept kicking the ground like he was trying to trip us. We nearly dropped him a few times. We came by the captain's office. A few others came out to help us. They had been grouping up to go to Delta Dorm, and now they saw what was waiting for them. They came out to help us drag him to medical. We were all completely soaked by the time we got to medical, and Miles had stopped gasping and started wheezing. The nurses took him from us and wheeled him to the back, gave him something to get his heart back on track, and called the hospital to get a bed ready for him. And we left him in their capable hands. But I couldn't help but look through the glass to Fraser in his infirmary bed. His head was bandaged, his eyes were blackened. He was staring at the ceiling as he lay there. His face, however, wore the most cherubic grin I'd ever seen on a grown man. It was hard to believe a man who smiled like that had been doing what he was doing. I went down to Delta Dorm after that to ask Freck what he'd seen. They say the kid was shaken up would have been an understatement. I found him sitting in one of those big, uncomfortable metal chairs we kept in the office, knees to his chest. As he breathed like he was having some kind of panic attack, he jumped. I touched his shoulder, not even hearing me come in. At the sight of someone like me, a real officer seemed to calm him. Take a seat across from him, much as you're doing here. Started making mental notes for later. He told me that Miles had been attacked by an inmate that had melted into clothes once it was done. He was out doing a walkthrough and making sure everyone was asleep, and he was coming through the bathrooms to get back to the station when something stepped out of a toilet stall and grabbed him. He grabbed him by the shoulders, and his hands kind of glowed? I don't know, man. I was beating on the glass. I was yelling at him to stop. Miles started convulsing and twitching like he was being electrocuted, and that's when I started yelling over the radio, telling people to come help. He pushed him against the sink then, and Miles jittered and shaked, and then you and Officer Grimes came bursting in, and he just melted. The kid looked pretty rattled. I took his post and let him come home. Freck went on to become a major. Freaking major. But I always remembered him as that scared as shit TA who nearly pissed his pants at Delta Dorm. This goes to show you. He finished another coffee, and I began to smell lunch smells wafting from the kitchen. Was it lunchtime already? It had just been morning time. How long had I been sitting there listening to this man tell me about a particular stretch in 1985? My phone vibrated in my pocket, freeing me from my trance, and I pulled it out to check my messages. My stomach dropped. And I was out of breath in a second. I gotta go. Crom looked worried. Everything okay? My mom's in the hospital with my grandpa. Someone tried to run him off the road. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. It really helps me out whenever you guys do things like listen or watch. And it really helps if you guys also subscribe to the podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel, or do things like clicking the bell or clicking the like button. Also, it's becoming allergy season, and it's affecting me, in case you couldn't tell. Well, I have one thing that actually does help me out, and that's the help from my wife's tea. My wife makes tea and sells it online at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocletea. If you guys want to test some for yourself, then head over to the shop, get yourself some of the Dark and Stormy Night, which is my personal favorite, and ask for the dabbing MrCreepyPasta sticker. And as always, I want to give a very special thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon. You guys are the ones who help me keep the lights on in the house, as well as allow me to do things like commission brand new stories. In case you guys haven't noticed, we hit that tier. So, a very special thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stricken, Chase Burnett, Deanna Kraus, G Weevil 3, Tristan Pelton, 1-800-Nightmare, Acid System, Aaron Stormcrow, Azurine Fox, Bobby Karman, Chris Lovins, Cryptic Nightmares, The Doctor, Daniel Polson, Dr. Stein and Mr. Happy, Eurogore, Freddy Krueger, Fried Chicken 12, Hades Nephew, InfernalOne, James Bruce, James Lowe, Jason VR Wilson, JimboTheHutt, Jordan Nells, Jordan Johnson, Caleb Dougal, Kiri the Sloth, Legit Quad Feed, Liam Newman, Lisa Cottrell, Marco Takes Dabs 420, Michael Scharbrough, Nico Kayo, Nina Smith, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Rafael Rodriguez, Robert White, S-Man, Sky Harbor, Snails Burnett, Talon Karlik, The Ginger Bros, Trace Miles, Tsuji Campbell, Tynannie, Unknown Nobody, Andre Garcia, Brianna Wright, Brian Ace, Caspian, hogunkji, and Someone You Love. And also a very special thank you to everybody who's down there in the description down below. All you guys who are listed as Patreons and everybody who's even supporting for just $1, I really love and appreciate you guys. And if you want to join them, you can always head over to patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. Even $1 a month, honestly, it keeps the show going. So thank you guys so much. And to everyone out there, sweet dreams.